Somewhere deep in prehistory, a single missing tool could decide who lived and who never saw the next sunrise. For early humans, a stone blade wasn't just an object, it was survival itself. Hunting, food, protection, even shelter, all depended on things they could easily lose and almost never replace. So what really happened when those tools disappeared? Why did losing them become a matter of life and death in a world that offered no backup, no second chances, and no replacements waiting nearby? Before we go deeper into this forgotten world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps bring more stories like this back to life. Because the truth about early humans and their tools is far more terrifying than most people realize. The ground is wet with old rain, pressed flat by many feet that no longer exist. A thin wind moves through a narrow valley where stone cliffs hold the last warmth of the day, and in the fading light, a small group of early humans works in uneasy silence. They're not building a shelter, they are searching. Their movements are controlled, urgent in a way that has nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with survival. Something has been lost. A single toolkit, no larger than what could fit in 2 hands, is missing. It contains flakes of sharpened stone, a core carefully prepared for future strikes, and a bone point used for cutting and scraping. Nothing about it looks extraordinary. Yet without it, the group's ability to process food, defend themselves, and prepare hides is sharply reduced. The absence of these objects is not symbolic. It is immediate. It is physical. It will become hunger within days if not recovered. One of them returns to the place where the group rested earlier. The soil there is disturbed, but not enough to explain where the bundle went. Another scans the riverbank, where movement and reflection blur together, making memory unreliable. The toolkit could have slipped into water, been carried off by a careless step, or simply left behind in a moment of exhaustion. The uncertainty itself becomes a threat. In a world without storage, without replacement, without redundancy, losing an object is not an inconvenience. It is a fracture in survival. Before going deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes this moment more than a simple accident is what it reveals about the entire structure of early human life. Tools are not secondary objects. They are extensions of the body, replacing claws that humans never evolved and teeth that are not strong enough for constant cutting. Without them, even basic tasks become exhausting or impossible. The group is not just missing equipment, they are missing capability. Archaeological evidence from early sites suggests that toolkits were often carefully curated rather than casually discarded. At places like Olduvai Gorge, stone tools appear in repeated patterns, suggesting they were carried, maintained, and reused over long periods. This means loss was not frequent, because loss was dangerous. Every object had weight beyond its material form. It carried labour, memory, and skill. What remains uncertain is how often such losses occurred. The archaeological record is silent on single moments of disappearance. Stone does not preserve absence. Yet patterns of careful transport and repair suggest that early humans lived with constant awareness of fragility. A dropped tool in a river, a forgotten bundle during migration, a break in a flint core at the wrong moment could shift the balance between survival and failure. In this valley, the group begins to retrace their steps more carefully. They move slower now, scanning the ground not just for resources, but for traces of their own recent past. The act of searching becomes a form of remembering. Every stone looks similar, yet some carry faint marks of human use, a chipped edge, A surface worn smooth by repeated handling, a fracture that only happens under deliberate force. These are the only clues that matter. The sun lowers further, and the landscape begins to lose detail. Shadows stretch across the ground, merging objects into uncertain shapes. Time itself becomes an enemy, because darkness will erase the possibility of recovery. If the toolkit is not found before night, it may as well no longer exist. This is the first lesson embedded in early human survival. Even if it was never consciously understood, objects are not permanent. They do not wait. They vanish easily. And when they do, the consequences ripple outward far beyond the moment of loss. The group spreads out again, each individual carrying the silent pressure of what cannot be replaced. Somewhere in this search lies a truth that defines much of human prehistory. Survival is not only about finding resources, it is about not losing the fragile extensions that make those resources usable in the first place. And in that tension between possession and absence, the deeper story of early human dependence on tools begins to take shape. The valley does not change, but perception of it does. To the group searching for the missing toolkit, every stone on the ground now carries the possibility of meaning. What was once background becomes evidence. What was once familiar becomes uncertain. Early human cognition, shaped by constant survival pressure, begins to tighten around the idea that objects in the world are either useful or dangerous, present or lost, remembered or gone. This shift is subtle, but it is one of the most important transformations in human prehistory. Tools are not just used, they are tracked, mentally mapped, and emotionally anchored. A stone blade is not interchangeable with another stone blade, even if they look identical. The differences are remembered through weight, balance, and the way it fits into a hand. Losing one is not the same as replacing it. It is closer to losing a known part of daily existence. Archaeological traces from early stone industries suggest that tool production was not random. At sites associated with early Homo species, flakes and cores show deliberate preparation, repeated methods, and a level of consistency that implies learned technique rather than instinct. This consistency is important because it means tools were not created in isolation each time. They were part of a remembered system. And anything that exists as a system becomes vulnerable when one of its parts disappears. The missing toolkit in the valley represents that vulnerability in its most immediate form. Without it, certain tasks must stop entirely. Cutting hides becomes slower, processing meat becomes inefficient, defensive readiness is reduced, even fire maintenance, depending on available tools, becomes more difficult. What seems like a small object is, in fact, a cluster of capabilities. Some members of the group begin to reconstruct the previous night's movements. Memory is not a fixed record. It is reconstructed through association where the fire was, where people slept, who handled which objects. But memory in early humans is also shaped by physical environment, a change in wind direction, the movement of animals, or the fading of a light can alter recall. The landscape itself becomes part of cognition. This is where the fragility of early tool dependence becomes more visible. Humans are not only dependent on tools, but also on the ability to remember where those tools are. There is no storage system beyond the mind and the immediate environment. No written record exists to anchor loss. A misplaced object is not just physically gone, it is cognitively destabilizing. At some point in the search, attention shifts toward the river again. Water is both resource and threat. It preserves nothing in this context except absence. If the toolkit fell into the current, it is effectively erased from practical recovery. Yet even that possibility must be checked. because uncertainty is worse than confirmation. Early survival often depends on closing mental gaps, even when the answer is unfavourable. This dynamic reveals something deeper about early human life. The value of tools is not only in what they do, but in the certainty they provide. A known blade means a known outcome when cutting. A known point means a predictable result when striking. When those objects vanish, uncertainty spreads into every action that depends on them. Meanwhile, the valley itself begins to shift with approaching dusk. Temperature drops slightly. Small animals move differently. The group's awareness expands outward, because the search for an object cannot be separated from the need to remain safe while searching. Even this adds pressure. Attention is split between recovery and survival. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies suggest that tool loss is often treated with extreme caution and sometimes ritualized attention, not because of symbolic meaning alone, but because of practical consequences. In environments where replacement is not immediate, every object must be accounted for. Early humans likely developed an implicit understanding that order in possessions directly correlates with survival stability. In the valley, that understanding is not abstract. It is felt in the slowing pace of movement, the narrowing of search patterns, the way individuals begin to converge again as visibility decreases. The group is not just looking for a missing item anymore. They are attempting to restore balance in a system that has been disrupted. And yet, even as they search, another realization begins to form beneath the surface of their actions. Tools are not simply lost because of accident. They are lost because the world does not hold them in place. Gravity, water, distance, distraction, and fatigue all work against permanence. In that sense, loss is not rare, it is inevitable. What remains uncertain in the archaeological record is how early humans emotionally processed this inevitability. There are no preserved expressions, no direct accounts, but the repeated evidence of careful transport, repair, and standardization suggests a constant awareness everything carried can be lost, and everything lost may not return. As darkness deepens, the valley becomes less a place of search and more a place of fading possibility. The toolkit, whether nearby or already gone beyond recovery, represents a central truth of early human existence. Survival depends not only on skill, but on continuity. And continuity, in a world without storage or surplus, is always at risk of breaking. The first stone tools do not appear like inventions in the modern sense. They emerge instead as repeated gestures embedded in survival routines, as if the act of striking one rock against another slowly reveals a pattern that nature itself does not resist. In scattered sites across Africa and Eurasia, archaeologists find the earliest consistent evidence of this behavior: sharp flakes detached from cores, edges intentionally shaped, and fragments left behind not as waste, but as traces of decision. These objects mark a turning point that is easy to underestimate. Before tools, survival is entirely dependent on what the body can do unaided. After tools, survival becomes distributed across body and object. That distribution is powerful, but also fragile. It introduces a new dependency that did not exist before. If the object disappears, the capability disappears with it. The group in the valley does not know they are part of a long technological lineage. They only know that certain stones, when struck correctly, produce edges that cut meat more efficiently than teeth ever could. They know that bone fractures can be cleaned more easily with a sharp flake. They know that hides become usable only when scraped properly. These are not theoretical insights. They are embodied knowledge, learned through repetition and error. What matters most is that these tools are not naturally occurring in usable form. A sharp edge is not simply found, it is produced. That production requires time, attention, and memory. A mistake in angle or force can destroy the core entirely, turning potential tools into useless fragments. This makes each successful tool a small achievement, not easily replaced. In early archaeological layers, particularly those associated with Oldowan technology, the simplicity of tools hides the complexity of their acquisition. A single flake may represent multiple failed attempts, each one consuming time and material. The raw stone itself is not uniformly available. Certain rock types fracture predictably, while others do not. Early humans had to learn this through trial, observation, and repetition across generations. This brings us to one of the hidden pressures behind tool-dependence material scarcity. Suitable stone is not evenly distributed across landscapes. It appears in riverbeds, exposed cliffs, and specific geological formations. Groups must either travel to these sources or carry usable material with them. Both choices create vulnerability. Travel increases exposure to risk. Carrying reduces mobility. In the valley, this vulnerability becomes more tangible with the missing toolkit. If the tools were lost far from a known source of raw material, replacement is not immediate. The group cannot simply produce new ones on demand. They must first relocate suitable stone, then invest time in shaping it. That delay can be measured in meals, in injuries untreated, in opportunities missed. Some members begin to reconsider earlier movements not just as memory, but as a chain of resource decisions, where stone was last worked, where flakes were left, where cores were carried. This mental reconstruction reflects a deeper reality. Early human cognition begins to integrate landscape and tool-making into a single system. The environment is not separate from technology, it is its foundation. What is particularly striking in archaeological evidence is how often early sites show transport of raw materials over distances that exceed immediate necessity. This suggests that early humans valued certain stones enough to carry them across terrain where similar-looking rocks existed but were not suitable. The difference was invisible to outsiders but critical to survival. This sensitivity to material quality implies a kind of learned perception. Not all stone is equal, even if it appears so. The ability to recognize fracture patterns, grain structure, and hardness is not instinctive. It is acquired through repeated interaction. Losing a toolkit, therefore, also means losing a set of refined relationships between human and material world. As the valley search continues into deeper dusk, the group's movements become more cautious. The awareness of fragility extends beyond the missing objects to the broader realization that every tool they currently possess carries the same risk. Nothing is permanent. Everything must be protected, remembered, and accounted for. At some point, the search begins to merge with silence. Words, if they exist at this stage of human evolution, are minimal. Communication is likely gesture, gaze, and movement. The absence of speech in the archaeological record leaves space for interpretation, but what is clear is that coordination still occurs, and coordination itself depends on shared understanding of value. That shared understanding is what allows early humans to function as technological beings. A tool is not valuable only because of its function, but because the group agrees on its function and maintains the knowledge required to recreate it. When a toolkit is lost, it is not only objects that disappear, it is part of that shared structure of knowledge temporarily disrupted. The valley grows darker, and the search becomes less productive. But the lesson embedded in this moment extends far beyond the immediate event. early humans are not simply using tools. They're living inside a system where survival depends on objects that can vanish without warning, and on knowledge that must be constantly renewed through fragile practice. And in that system, loss is never just an accident. It is a constant possibility shaping every movement, every decision, and every quiet moment of attention. The human mind that remembers stone does not operate like a modern archive. It is not precise, nor does it store information in fixed units. Instead, it builds patterns out of repetition, movement, and sensory feedback. A flake of stone is remembered not as an object with coordinates, but as the feeling of pressure at the moment it detached, the angle of impact, the sound it made when it struck another surface, and the way it fit into the hand afterward. This form of memory is powerful in its own way, but also fragile. It depends on continued interaction. Without repeated practice, the memory weakens. Without the object itself, the mental model becomes harder to reconstruct. This is why the loss of a toolkit is not just a material loss, it is also a cognitive disruption. It interrupts the feedback loop between hand, stone, and environment that sustains technological knowledge. In early human groups, toolmaking is not a separate activity from survival. It is woven into daily rhythm. Stones are struck when time allows, not as a specialized craft but as an extension of routine. Yet even in this simplicity lies complexity. The sequence of actions required to produce a usable edge must be remembered, exactly selecting the right core, positioning it correctly, applying force at the right point, anticipating fracture paths that cannot be seen but must be understood through experience. Archaeological studies of napping debris show that early humans were already sensitive to efficiency. Certain striking patterns repeat across sites separated by vast distances, suggesting shared knowledge or convergent learning. This repetition is not accidental. It reflects a mental framework where successful outcomes are encoded through imitation and correction over time. But this framework depends on continuity. When tools are lost, the continuity breaks. The group in the valley is not only searching for objects, they are searching for stability in a system that relies on physical reinforcement. Without the familiar weight of the missing tools in their hands, even remembered techniques become harder to execute with confidence. There is also a deeper implication. Tool use requires anticipation. A stone blade is created not for immediate use alone, but for future use under uncertain conditions. This means early humans must think beyond the present moment in a very practical sense. They must imagine future needs, future tasks, future dangers. Losing tools therefore disrupts not only the present, but the projected future as well. What makes this even more significant is that early human environments are not stable. Climate fluctuations, shifting animal migrations, and seasonal changes constantly reshape resource availability. In such a world, tools function as buffers against unpredictability. They allow flexibility. They extend the body's capacity into situations where raw survival would otherwise fail. When a toolkit disappears, that buffer collapses. The group becomes more exposed to immediate environmental pressures. Even simple tasks, like processing food quickly before predators arrive, become slower and riskier. This increases the urgency of recovery, but also highlights a contradiction. Searching for lost tools requires time and energy that are themselves scarce. In archaeological contexts, we sometimes see evidence of what could be called technological redundancy in later periods, multiple similar tools stored or carried in parallel. But in the earlier stages of human tool use, such redundancy is limited. Resources are too scarce, and production too costly, to allow surplus. Every object must justify its existence through immediate or near-immediate use. This makes early human technology fundamentally different from later human technology. It is not about accumulation, it is about continuity. And continuity is fragile because it depends on both memory and material stability. As the group moves through the dimming valley, their search patterns begin to reflect this fragility. They revisit places not only where objects might have been lost, but where actions were previously performed. A moment of rest becomes a possible site of recovery. A place where stone was struck becomes a point of return. The landscape is no longer neutral, it is layered with recent history. Yet even this strategy has limits. The valley is large enough that a small object, especially one made of stone that blends into its surroundings, can disappear visually within seconds. Grass, shadows, and uneven terrain all conspire to conceal what is already difficult to distinguish. At some point, the search transitions into diminishing probability. The group does not abandon effort, but effort becomes less certain. Each step forward carries less expectation of success. This emotional shift is subtle, but important. It reflects an early form of cost-benefit reasoning embedded in survival behavior, where energy expenditure must eventually be weighed against diminishing returns. What remains striking in this scenario is how modern the problem feels, despite its ancient setting. The dependence on small, easily lost objects that enable complex systems is not unique to prehistory. It is a defining feature of technological life itself. But in this early context, the consequences are immediate and unforgiving. As darkness settles further, the group is forced to confront a reality that is both simple and profound. Their survival is tied not only to skill or strength, but to continuity of objects that the world does not guarantee to preserve. The mind can remember, but memory alone cannot replace what has physically vanished. And in that gap between memory and material loss, early human vulnerability becomes fully visible. The world offers no stable guarantee that materials will remain where they are placed. For early humans, this instability is not an abstract idea but a constant lived condition. Stone tools, bone points, and wooden implements exist in a state of perpetual risk, shaped by gravity, water, animals, and simple human forgetfulness. Among these forces, material scarcity stands out as the quiet constraint that defines every technological decision. Not every stone can become a tool. Even within the same landscape, differences in mineral structure determine whether a rock will fracture cleanly or collapse into unusable fragments. Early humans learn this through repeated failure. A promising-looking stone may shatter incorrectly. Another, less visually impressive, may produce a perfect sharp edge. Over time, this creates a learned sensitivity that is difficult to describe but essential for survival. In archaeological layers from early Paleolithic contexts, geologists and archaeologists often identify preferred raw material sourcing, where specific rock types are consistently selected over others. This selection behavior implies knowledge of material quality that is not obvious at first glance. It also implies movement sometimes over significant distances to access those materials. Such movement carries its own risks, including exposure to predators, environmental stress, and the possibility of returning empty-handed. The missing toolkit in the valley sits at the center of this larger reality. If it was made from high-quality stone, its loss is even more severe, because replacement is not simply a matter of picking up a nearby rock. It requires returning to a known source, re-establishing the sequence of production, and investing time that may not be available in moments of survival pressure. As the group continues searching, the awareness of scarcity becomes more pronounced. Every object they currently possess is mentally re-evaluated. A blade is no longer just a blade. It is a non-replaceable investment of effort and knowledge. A scraping tool is not just useful, it is irreplaceable under current conditions. This mental shift reflects a broader principal value in early human technology is not intrinsic to objects alone, but to their accessibility and reproducibility. What complicates this further is the unpredictability of resource availability across time. A stone source that is accessible today may become inaccessible tomorrow due to flooding, erosion, or migration. Animal patterns change, vegetation shifts, and river courses alter the landscape. Early humans live within this instability, meaning that even replacement resources cannot be assumed to remain available. This is why carrying tools becomes essential, but also risky. Carrying increases survival capability but reduces mobility and increases the consequences of loss. A group carrying a carefully curated toolkit is effectively carrying its operational capacity with it. If that bundle is lost, the group does not simply lose objects, it loses a portion of its adaptive range. In the valley, the search becomes increasingly intertwined with the realization that recovery may not be guaranteed. The group's movements are still deliberate, but there is a subtle shift in urgency toward conservation of remaining resources. Energy is not infinite. Time before nightfall is not infinite, and attention itself begins to fragment under the pressure of multiple competing needs: safety, shelter, and now, recovery of lost capability. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans often revisited sites of previous activity multiple times, sometimes long after initial occupation. This pattern may reflect not only resource extraction, but also attempts to recover or reuse previously abandoned materials. In such a world, nothing is truly discarded in the modern sense. Everything is either in use, temporarily set aside, or lost. As shadows deepen, the valley's terrain becomes harder to interpret. Small depressions and uneven ground hide potential clues. A flake of stone might lie partially embedded in soil, indistinguishable from natural fragments. Even a complete tool, if present, could be visually masked by surrounding textures. The environment does not cooperate with recovery. At this stage, the group's search begins to rely more heavily on pattern recognition than direct visual detection. They look for anomalies, places where the ground appears slightly disturbed, where movement may have occurred, where a human action might have altered the natural arrangement of stones and soil. This is an early form of forensic awareness, though it is entirely practical rather than conceptual. Yet even this approach has limits. Time erases traces, wind smooths surfaces, footsteps blend back into terrain. The longer the delay between loss and search, the more the environment reasserts its neutrality. What remains particularly striking is how dependent survival becomes on the smallest margins. A single object, no larger than a hand, can influence food processing efficiency, defense capability, and even social coordination within the group. This concentration of function in small artifacts is what makes early human technology both powerful and fragile. Eventually, as the last usable light fades from the valley, the search approaches a threshold where continuation becomes inefficient. The group has not resolved the loss, but they have expanded their understanding of it. The toolkit may still exist somewhere within the landscape, or it may already be beyond recovery. Both possibilities carry consequences, but neither can be confirmed. This unresolved state is itself significant. Early human survival is often shaped not by clear outcomes, but by sustained uncertainty. The inability to confirm loss or recovery forces adaptive behavior that balances hope, caution, and resource management. And in that balance, the fragile foundation of early technological dependence becomes even clearer. Survival is not just about using tools, but about maintaining continuity in a world where continuity is never guaranteed. The landscape beyond the valley is not empty, but it is indifferent. Hills rise and fall in slow repetition, broken by scattered stone outcrops and thin lines of vegetation that follow water routes. For early humans, this kind of terrain is both opportunity and risk. It contains the materials they need to rebuild what is lost, but it also stretches distance between resources, increasing the cost of every search. Journeys to find the right rock are not casual excursions. They are calculated movements through space where every kilometre matters. Groups learn to read landscapes not just for food and water, but for geological signatures. A ridge of exposed stone might indicate usable raw material. A riverbed might reveal rounded cobbles suitable for napping. A cliff face might contain layers that fracture predictably. These observations are not scientific in a modern sense, but they are systematic in practice. The importance of material sourcing becomes clearer when considering how early technology depends on consistency. A tool is only reliable if its production can be repeated with predictable results. That predictability is not guaranteed by skill alone. It depends on the quality of the raw material. A skilled hand striking poor stone produces failure. An inexperienced hand striking good stone may still produce success. This imbalance makes material selection as important as technique itself. In many archaeological sites, researchers find evidence that early humans transported stone over distances that exceed what would be necessary if local materials were sufficient. This suggests a deliberate preference for certain stone types, even when alternatives were available nearby. Such behavior indicates that early humans were not simply reacting to immediate surroundings, but actively managing material quality over time. In the context of the missing toolkit, this becomes especially important. If the tools were made from carefully selected material, their loss represents more than inconvenience. It represents the loss of a curated set of edges that cut more cleanly, points that fracture less unpredictably, and surfaces that maintain durability under repeated use. Replacement is not just about quantity, but about matching quality. As the group expands their search beyond the immediate valley, the scale of the problem changes. What was once a localized loss now becomes a spatial challenge. The toolkit could be anywhere along their previous movement path, or even outside it if it was dropped during transit. This uncertainty forces a broader awareness of landscape memory, where every location visited in recent days becomes a potential site of recovery. Movement across terrain is also constrained by energy economics. Early humans cannot afford to search endlessly. Every step consumes calories that must be recovered through food acquisition. This creates a tension between searching for lost tools and securing immediate survival needs. It is a balance that must be constantly negotiated. Environmental instability adds another layer of difficulty. Weather shifts can obscure tracks, rain can erase footprints, wind can redistribute lightweight fragments of stone or hide them beneath dust. Even animal activity can disturb or relocate small objects. In such conditions, the physical persistence of a lost toolkit becomes uncertain almost immediately after its disappearance. Yet early humans persist in searching because the alternative is more costly. Without tools, efficiency in processing food drops significantly. Tasks that would take minutes extend into hours. This increases exposure to predators and reduces time available for rest and travel. The loss, therefore, creates a feedback loop of vulnerability that reinforces the urgency of recovery. At a cognitive level, This kind of search behavior reflects a growing ability to mentally map space over time. Early humans begin to associate not just places, but sequences of places where they were yesterday, what they carried, what actions they performed. This sequential mapping is an important step in the development of spatial reasoning tied to survival technology. Still, no amount of mapping can fully overcome the randomness of loss. A toolkit dropped into tall grass or buried under shifting sediment may remain invisible even within a few meters of repeated searching. This introduces a frustrating asymmetry. Effort does not always correlate with success. Some anthropological interpretations suggest that such experiences may have contributed to early forms of caution in tool handling. Bundling tools together, carrying them close to the body, and establishing habitual storage behaviors near campsites may all be responses to repeated experiences of loss. Even if not consciously theorized, these behaviors reduce risk through repetition. In the valley's extended search area, the group begins to encounter diminishing returns. The further they move from the original point of loss, the less likely recovery becomes. Yet turning back also carries uncertainty, because it assumes the toolkit is not elsewhere. This creates a spatial ambiguity that cannot be fully resolved with available information. What becomes increasingly clear is that early human survival systems are not designed for redundancy. There is no backup toolkit waiting elsewhere. There is no stored reserve of identical tools. Each object is part of a single, fragile chain of continuity that extends from production to use to maintenance. As the group pauses briefly on higher ground, the landscape spreads out below them in uneven layers of shadow and fading light. From this vantage, the scale of the search becomes visible. It is small against the vastness of terrain. This contrast emphasizes the core reality of their situation. Survival systems are local, but loss operates across distance. And in that gap between local control and spatial uncertainty lies the deeper tension of early technological dependence. Tools extend human capability, but they also extend vulnerability across space. Once lost, they do not simply disappear, they become embedded in a landscape that does not return what it takes. The group begins to turn back, not because the problem is resolved, but because the limits of search have been reached. What remains is uncertainty, carried forward like everything else they cannot recover. The return toward the original campsite is slower than the outward search, not because the terrain has changed, but because the mind has. Every step now carries the weight of reconsideration. The group is no longer searching outward for something new. They are revisiting a narrowing set of possibilities, each one already tested once and found uncertain. This shift marks an important psychological threshold from active recovery to acceptance of potential permanent loss. In early human survival systems, loss is not a rare event. It is a recurring condition. But what transforms loss into crisis is not frequency, but dependency. A tool is not valuable because it exists, but because its absence interrupts a chain of actions. When that chain breaks, the consequences spread outward into every task that relies on it. At the campsite, the ground is now darker, textures less distinct. The remains of earlier activity are still visible, but softened by fading light, ash from a fire pit, flattened vegetation where bodies once rested, scattered fragments of bone or stone that were not collected. This is the environment where the toolkit was last certainly present. Everything beyond this point is inference. The group begins to re-examine the campsite with renewed attention, but the logic of search has changed. Earlier, they were tracking movement across landscape. Now they are reconstructing micro-events. Who stood where? Which direction hands moved? Where objects were last handled? This level of detail reflects an implicit understanding that loss often occurs in transition moments, not in stationary ones. Archaeological interpretations of early campsite structures suggest that repeated use of certain locations was common. These sites show layered occupation, with artifacts embedded in stratified deposits. This indicates that early humans returned to familiar spaces, possibly because familiarity reduced cognitive load and improved coordination. In such spaces, the handling of tools becomes routine, which also increases the likelihood of accidental misplacement. One possibility is emerging more clearly within the group's reconstruction. The toolkit may not have been violently lost, but gently displaced. A moment of rest, a shift in position, a bundle set down temporarily and not retrieved. These are the kinds of losses that leave no dramatic trace, only absence. What makes this especially dangerous is that such losses are hardest to detect immediately. There is no clear boundary between possession and loss in transitional moments. A tool placed on the ground while adjusting posture may feel still present in memory even after it is no longer physically present. This delay between perception and reality is critical in early environments where objects are not continuously monitored. The group moves through the campsite in overlapping paths, each individual revisiting familiar points. Their actions are coordinated but not identical. Each search pattern reflects a slightly different reconstruction of events. This variation itself becomes a form of evidence, highlighting how memory is distributed rather than unified. At the edge of the campsite, where vegetation begins to thicken, attention focuses on transitional zones. These are areas where objects are most likely to be lost thresholds between activity and movement, between rest and departure. Archaeological sites often show higher concentrations of small artifacts in such zones, suggesting repeated accidental deposition over time. Yet even here, nothing clearly identifies the missing toolkit. The absence remains consistent, which paradoxically provides its own form of information. If the toolkit were nearby, repeated search would likely reveal at least partial fragments. The lack of such evidence begins to shift probability toward more distant loss or environmental displacement. Environmental factors now re-enter the analysis. Wind patterns during the previous night may have shifted light materials. Animals moving through the area could have disturbed or carried small objects unknowingly. Rain earlier in the cycle could have softened ground surfaces, allowing partial burial. Each possibility introduces a different form of disappearance, none of which can be confirmed. This uncertainty forces a difficult cognitive adjustment. Early humans must operate without closure. The toolkit is neither confirmed lost nor confirmed present. It exists in a state of unresolved absence, which still affects behavior. Decisions must be made despite incomplete information. At this stage, the group's behavior begins to reflect a broader survival principle that appears repeatedly in ethnographic analogues. When recovery becomes uncertain, adaptation begins. Even without explicit acknowledgement, actions shift toward minimizing dependency on missing resources. Remaining tools are handled more carefully. Tasks are adjusted to reduce strain. Energy expenditure is recalibrated. What is striking is that this adjustment happens without formal planning. It is embedded in perception and response. Early humans do not separate problem solving from living. The two are the same process. Loss automatically reshapes behavior because behavior is continuously tied to material conditions. As the search at the campsite concludes without resolution, the emotional tone of the group shifts subtly. There is no dramatic reaction, no visible rupture. Instead, there is a quiet narrowing of focus. Attention begins to move away from recovery and toward continuity with what remains. This moment marks a transition in the larger pattern of early human tool dependence. It reveals that survival is not only about possession of tools, but about the ability to function under partial loss. Systems that rely on fragile objects must also be able to absorb failure without collapsing entirely. And in this unresolved absence, the deeper structure of early technological life becomes clearer. Tools are not guaranteed. Recovery is not guaranteed. And yet survival continues. The tension between these truths defines much of prehistoric human existence. Knowledge in early human groups does not exist as a separate archive of information. It is embedded in bodies, gestures, and shared attention. The act of making a tool is not only a technical process, but a sequence of remembered movements that must be performed in a precise order for success to occur. A slight change in angle or force can shift a usable edge into useless debris, and that sensitivity must be learned through repetition rather than instruction alone. This form of knowledge transmission is fragile because it depends on proximity. One individual observing another must be close enough to see detail, close enough to repeat action, and present long enough for correction to occur. Unlike later forms of communication, there is no external record to preserve technique. If the demonstrator is absent, or if the group becomes dispersed, the knowledge weakens over time. In this context, the missing toolkit represents more than material absence. It represents a disruption in practiced knowledge. Even if the group still remembers how to make tools, the absence of physical reference points reduces confidence in execution. Memory without reinforcement gradually loses precision, especially when environmental stress limits opportunities for practice. Archaeological evidence from early tool traditions suggests that learning curves were steep and error-prone. Sites often show clusters of failed flakes alongside successful tools, indicating repeated attempts and gradual refinement. This pattern implies that toolmaking was not a one-time discovery, but a continuous process of adjustment across generations. The group in the valley, now operating without their full set of tools, begins to rely more heavily on existing knowledge of repair rather than replacement. Broken edges may be reworked. Fragments may be reshaped into smaller implements. This behavior is not improvisation in a modern sense, but a necessity-driven extension of existing technique. What is particularly important is that repair itself requires tools. A broken blade can only be reshaped if another tool exists to apply controlled force. This creates a recursive dependency. Tools are needed to maintain tools. Once the system is reduced below a certain threshold, repair becomes impossible, and replacement becomes the only option. If replacement is delayed, functional capacity declines rapidly. In many early sites, archaeologists find evidence of intensive reuse, where artifacts show multiple stages of modification. A single core may be struck, reshaped, struck again, and eventually reduced to a size that is barely usable. This suggests that early humans extracted maximum value from each material object before discarding it, likely because replacement was uncertain or costly. The missing toolkit therefore disrupts not only immediate function but the entire maintenance cycle. Without it, even surviving tools become harder to sustain. The group's remaining implements must now bear greater workload, increasing wear and reducing lifespan. This creates a cascading effect where loss accelerates further loss. As the group continues adapting, knowledge transmission becomes even more critical. Individuals must coordinate without relying on redundancy in tools. Tasks that were previously distributed may now require more careful sequencing. The success of one action depends more directly on the previous one, increasing sensitivity to failure at every step. This increasing fragility is not immediately visible in behavior, but it is present in structure. Movements become more deliberate, actions are less exploratory. Efficiency replaces experimentation. In stable conditions, experimentation can lead to improvement. In unstable conditions, it becomes risk. Anthropological parallels suggest that such constraints often shape cultural transmission over long periods. Techniques that survive are not necessarily the most complex, but the most reliable under resource limitations. Simplicity becomes a form of resilience. In the valley context, the absence of the toolkit begins to influence not just material capability, but the rhythm of daily activity. Tasks that once occurred in parallel may now be sequenced. Waiting becomes necessary. Prioritization becomes unavoidable. Even attention becomes more narrowly focused on immediate utility. Yet despite this narrowing, the underlying system remains intact. The group still remembers how tools function. They still understand their importance. What is missing is not knowledge itself, but the physical reinforcement that stabilizes that knowledge in practice. This distinction is crucial. Early human survival depends on both memory and material. Memory without material cannot act. Material without memory cannot be used effectively. The two must remain in constant alignment, or the system begins to degrade. As time passes in the valley, the absence of the toolkit becomes less about a single lost event and more about a structural vulnerability. It exposes how dependent early human systems are on continuity across multiple layers: physical objects, learned behavior, environmental stability, and social coordination. Even as the group adjusts, the underlying tension remains unresolved. The toolkit has not been recovered, yet its absence continues to shape every action that follows. It exists now as a gap in capability rather than a missing object in space. And within that gap, early human technological life reveals one of its most defining characteristics. Progress is always balanced against fragility, and survival depends on maintaining systems that can fail at any moment without warning. When one failure occurs in early human life, it rarely remains isolated. The loss of a single tool does not simply reduce efficiency in a single task. It alters the entire chain of actions that depend on that tool. Hunting becomes slower, processing becomes delayed, and movement becomes more cautious. Over time, these small delays accumulate into broader vulnerability, shaping how the group interacts with its environment. In the valley, the absence of the toolkit begins to express itself not as a single problem, but as a series of minor constraints. Tasks that were once fluid now require pauses. Edges that once cut cleanly now require repeated effort. Materials that were once processed quickly now demand more time and attention. Each of these changes seems small in isolation, but together they reshape the rhythm of survival. This cascading effect is not unique to this moment. Archaeological patterns suggest that early human tool use operated within tightly interdependent systems. A scraper is not just a scraper, it is part of a sequence that includes hunting, butchering, hide processing, and shelter preparation. Interrupting any one part of the sequence affects the entire cycle. What makes this particularly significant is that early human groups do not have excess capacity. There is no surplus workforce, no stored inventory, and no reserve toolkit waiting to replace what is lost. Everything operates close to the threshold of necessity. This means that even minor disruptions can have disproportionate consequences. As the group adapts to the missing tools, they begin to unconsciously redistribute labor. Certain tasks take longer, requiring more patience from those involved. Others are delayed until conditions are more favorable. This restructuring is not planned, but emergent. arising from the simple reality that some actions now require more effort than before. Environmental pressure intensifies this effect. If prey becomes scarce or weather shifts unexpectedly, the reduced efficiency caused by tool loss becomes more critical. In such conditions, survival margins narrow. A delay in processing food can mean missing a safe window before scavengers or predators arrive. A delay in preparing hides can reduce protection during cold nights. Archaeological evidence from multiple Paleolithic contexts shows that tool assemblages often correlate strongly with environmental stress periods. During harsher climatic phases, tool use becomes more intensive, more specialized, and more carefully maintained. This suggests that environmental pressure amplifies the importance of every individual object. In the valley, the group is now operating under this amplified dependency. Every remaining tool carries more weight in the overall system. Each action that uses a tool is now more consequential, because the margin for replacement is gone. The absence of redundancy means that wear and damage have greater long-term impact. One of the more subtle consequences of this situation is behavioral caution. Early humans begin to handle tools more carefully, not because of abstract understanding of loss, but because repeated experience reinforces the cost of failure. A broken edge is not just an inconvenience, it is a reduction in capability that cannot easily be restored. This cautious behavior is reflected in the archaeological record through patterns of tool maintenance. Many early tools show evidence of repeated resharpening, suggesting that rather than discarding worn objects, groups extended their usability as long as possible. This behavior becomes more pronounced in contexts where raw material access is limited or unpredictable. Another important factor is social coordination. In small groups, tasks are often shared, but tool dependence can introduce asymmetry. Individuals with access to functional tools may become central to certain activities, increasing their importance within the group's daily survival structure. Loss of tools can therefore indirectly affect social dynamics by redistributing responsibility. In the valley, these changes remain subtle, but they are present in the structure of interaction. Actions become more deliberate, less redundant. Coordination becomes more essential because inefficiency can no longer be absorbed easily. Every mistake carries greater cost. Yet despite these pressures, the group continues to function. This continuity is significant. It demonstrates that early human systems are resilient not because they avoid failure, but because they adapt to it in real time. Even without full recovery of lost tools, survival continues through adjustment rather than restoration. The missing toolkit, however, remains a silent reference point. It is not actively discussed in any formal way, but its absence shapes decisions indirectly. It defines limits on what can be done quickly, what must be delayed, and what must be conserved. What emerges from this is a deeper understanding of early technological dependence. Tools are not isolated objects of utility. They are embedded within a network of actions, materials, and expectations. When one element of that network disappears, the effects propagate outward in ways that are not immediately visible but deeply felt. And within that propagation lies one of the core truths of early human survival. Stability is not defined by the presence of tools, but by the ability to continue functioning when tools are lost. The ground beneath ancient campsites holds more than the remnants of daily life. It preserves patterns of behavior that were never consciously recorded, yet remain legible in stone, bone, and soil. At certain archaeological sites, clusters of lithic debris reveal repeated activity zones where toolmaking, use, and repair occurred in overlapping cycles. These traces suggest that early humans did not simply use tools, They lived around them in structured, repeated routines. Within such campsites, the absence of a toolkit would not leave a direct mark. Stone does not record loss. Instead, it leaves indirect signals, shifts in activity patterns, changes in material distribution, and subtle differences in how often certain tools were used or repaired. Archaeologists interpret these patterns as evidence of adaptation to scarcity or disruption, though the exact causes remain uncertain in most cases. In the valley, the missing toolkit exists only as absence, but its effects would, in principle, resemble these archaeological signatures. Tasks that once occurred in a predictable spatial arrangement begin to shift. Areas of repeated activity become more concentrated as tools are shared or substituted. Movement patterns tighten, reflecting a reduction in available functional resources. One of the most revealing aspects of early human sites is the evidence of careful reuse. Tools are not discarded at the first sign of wear. Instead, they are gradually reduced, reshaped, and repurposed until they can no longer serve their original function. This indicates a system where material objects are treated as extended-use assets rather than disposable items. In such a system, every loss is amplified because replacement cycles are slow. The missing toolkit interrupts this cycle entirely. Without it, the group must rely on whatever remains, pushing existing tools beyond their intended lifespan. This increases the intensity of wear and accelerates the breakdown of remaining resources. In effect, the system begins to compress under pressure. Archaeological evidence from sites under environmental stress often shows similar compression. Tool diversity decreases, and functional overlap increases. Fewer types of tools are used to perform a wider range of tasks, indicating a shift toward generalization under constraint. This is not innovation in the modern sense, but adaptation under necessity. In the valley, such adaptation would emerge naturally. When specialized tools are unavailable, broader, less efficient methods must be used. Tasks that were once separated become merged. Cutting, scraping, and processing may rely on the same limited set of implements, increasing wear and reducing efficiency. This change also affects time. Early human survival is deeply time-sensitive. Food processing, shelter preparation, and movement across terrain all operate within narrow environmental windows. Tool efficiency directly influences how much can be accomplished within those windows. When tools are lost, time becomes compressed. The relationship between time and technology in early human life is often underestimated. A sharp edge does not only make work easier, it reduces exposure time in dangerous environments. A faster process is not only efficient, it is safer. Losing tools therefore extends exposure to risk, even when no direct threat is present. In the valley, this extended exposure would manifest in subtle behavioral shifts. Tasks would be prioritized not only by importance but by duration. Shorter tasks might be favored because they reduce time spent in vulnerable conditions. Longer tasks might be delayed or broken into segments. These adjustments are not planned strategies, but emergent responses to constraint. What remains particularly important is that these changes accumulate silently. There is no single moment where the system breaks. Instead, there is gradual tightening, where each adjustment reduces flexibility slightly more than before. Over time, this leads to a state where fewer options remain available. Archaeological interpretations of early human resilience suggest that survival in such conditions depends heavily on redundancy, not in tools themselves, but in behavior. Groups that can shift strategies quickly are more likely to persist through material loss. This flexibility becomes as important as the tools themselves. However, flexibility has limits. Without sufficient material support, behavioral adaptation alone cannot fully compensate. At some point, reduced tool availability constrains what is physically possible, regardless of skill or coordination. The missing toolkit represents that boundary. It marks the point where adaptation begins to replace capability rather than supplement it. The group does not stop functioning, but the range of possible actions narrows. As the valley darkens further, this narrowing becomes more pronounced. Activities slow, not because of exhaustion alone, but because each remaining task carries higher relative cost. The absence of the toolkit is no longer just a past event. It is an ongoing condition shaping present behavior. And in that condition, early human life reveals one of its most fundamental truths. Survival is not defined by stability, but by continuous adjustment within systems that are always one loss away from imbalance. Where is not a sudden event in early human technology? It is a slow accumulation of tiny failures, each one barely noticeable on its own. A sharpened edge dulls after repeated contact with hide and bone. A fracture line spreads microscopically with every impact. A handle loosens slightly after repeated grip and pressure. None of these changes are catastrophic at first, but together they define the lifespan of every tool. In the valley, with the toolkit missing, this process of wear becomes more critical because there is no immediate replacement. Remaining tools are pushed beyond their usual cycle of use. What would normally be a moment of repair or replacement becomes extended operation under stress. This accelerates degradation in ways that are not immediately visible but inevitable over time. Microscopic analysis of early stone tools from archaeological sites often reveals multiple stages of retouching. Edges are reshaped repeatedly, sometimes to the point where the original form is nearly unrecognizable. This indicates a persistent effort to extend usability rather than discard and replace. In environments where raw materials are scarce or difficult to access, this behavior becomes essential for survival. The absence of the toolkit disrupts this cycle of maintenance. Tools that would normally be rotated or supplemented must now carry a disproportionate share of work. This increases the rate at which they deteriorate. The system begins to lose flexibility, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual narrowing of functional capacity. One of the most important consequences of this is increased sensitivity to error. When tools are abundant, mistakes can be absorbed. A broken blade can be replaced. A failed attempt at processing can be corrected with another tool. But when tools are limited, every mistake becomes more expensive. This changes behavior in subtle but significant ways. Early human groups likely developed heightened caution in response to this pressure. Movements become more precise. Actions become more deliberate. Risk-taking decreases because the cost of failure is no longer distributed across surplus resources. Instead, it is concentrated in a small set of irreplaceable objects. This behavioral shift is reflected indirectly in archaeological patterns. Sites associated with resource scarcity often show reduced variability in tool types and more standardized forms. This suggests that under pressure, innovation may decrease while efficiency and reliability become dominant selection factors. In the valley, this would manifest as a narrowing of activity patterns. Tasks that once allowed experimentation become constrained by available tools. Certain methods may be abandoned not because they are ineffective, but because they are too costly in terms of wear and risk. Another layer of consequence emerges in the relationship between tool use and physical effort. As tools degrade, more force is required to achieve the same result. A dull edge requires more pressure. A worn scraper requires repeated passes. This increases energy expenditure, which must be balanced against limited food intake. This energy imbalance creates a feedback loop. Increased effort leads to faster fatigue. Faster fatigue reduces efficiency. Reduced efficiency increases time spent on tasks. Increased time raises exposure to environmental risks. Each step reinforces the next, tightening the constraints on survival. What is particularly significant is that this loop operates without conscious recognition of its structure. Early humans respond to immediate pressures, not systemic models. Yet the outcome is the same gradual intensification of vulnerability when tools are lost or degraded. The missing toolkit intensifies this process because it removes a critical buffer. Normally, degraded tools would be supplemented or replaced before reaching failure points. Without that option, the group must push remaining tools further, increasing the likelihood of breakdown at unpredictable moments. Archaeological evidence suggests that such stress conditions often lead to increased repair attempts. Even minimal fragments of usable material are preserved and modified. This reflects a deep awareness of scarcity, where almost any material object may have potential future utility. In the valley, such behavior would not be exceptional but necessary. Even broken fragments from remaining tools become valuable. Nothing is fully discarded. Everything is evaluated for possible reuse. This constant reassessment of material value reflects a survival logic shaped by absence. At the same time, the group must also manage cognitive load. Maintaining awareness of multiple degrading tools, changing task requirements, and environmental pressures requires continuous attention. This mental effort itself becomes a form of resource consumption. What emerges is a system under compounding stress, physical wear, energy depletion, and cognitive strain all reinforcing one another. Yet despite this, the system continues to function. This persistence is one of the defining features of early human survival systems. They do not require optimal conditions to operate. They require only enough continuity to avoid total collapse. And within that fragile continuity, the absence of a single toolkit continues to shape every action, not as a single loss event, but as an ongoing condition that alters the balance between effort and survival. Climate does not change evenly in the world of early humans. It shifts in pulses, sometimes subtle and sometimes abrupt, reshaping landscapes faster than memory can fully adapt. A valley that was once stable and predictable can become colder, drier, or more unpredictable within a single human lifetime. These fluctuations do not merely alter resources, they redefine what survival requires. In such unstable conditions, tools become even more essential. A sharper blade reduces the time needed to process scarce food. A stronger scraper makes it possible to extract usable material from tougher hides. A well-shaped point increases efficiency in hunting when prey becomes harder to find. Each improvement is not just convenience, but compensation for environmental stress. The missing toolkit therefore exists at a critical intersection between technology and climate pressure. Its absence does not occur in isolation. It occurs within a system already under strain. When environmental conditions worsen, the cost of lost capability increases exponentially. What might have been manageable in stable conditions becomes urgent under stress. Archaeological evidence from multiple prehistoric transitions shows a consistent pattern. During periods of climatic instability, tool assemblages often become more specialized and more intensively used. This suggests that early humans respond to environmental pressure not by abandoning technology, but by relying on it more heavily. Tools become buffers against uncertainty. In the valley, even without knowing broader climatic patterns, the group would feel these pressures directly. Food sources may shift location, animal behavior may become less predictable, water availability may fluctuate. Each of these changes increases dependence on efficient tool use, making the absence of the toolkit more consequential with each passing day. One of the most important effects of climate stress is time compression. Seasonal windows for food gathering and processing become narrower. Tasks that could once be spread across days must now be completed quickly before conditions change. Tools that increase efficiency are therefore not just helpful, they are critical for survival within shrinking timeframes. Without the toolkit, the group must operate within reduced efficiency margins. Tasks take longer, and longer tasks increase exposure to environmental risks. This creates a structural vulnerability where even small delays can have cascading consequences for survival success. Another subtle effect is mobility. As resources become more dispersed under changing climate conditions, groups may need to travel further to maintain access to food and raw materials. Mobility requires lightweight, portable, and reliable tools. Losing a toolkit reduces not only current capability but also future flexibility and movement. This is where the absence becomes especially significant. A group without a full set of tools is less able to adapt to changing locations. Decisions about movement become more constrained. Staying in one place may become necessary even when resources decline, simply because moving without adequate tools increases risk. Archaeological interpretations of migration patterns suggest that technological capacity often influences mobility decisions. Groups with more robust toolkits can exploit wider ranges of environments. Those with reduced tool availability are more likely to remain in localized areas until conditions force relocation. In the valley, such constraints would gradually shape behavior. Even without explicit planning, the group's options narrow. The absence of tools reduces the viability of certain activities, which in turn reduces the range of environments that can be successfully exploited. This creates a secondary effect: increased pressure on remaining resources. As mobility decreases, local resources are consumed more intensively. This intensification can accelerate depletion, further tightening survival margins. Once again, a feedback loop emerges, driven not by a single event but by interconnected dependencies. Climate instability also increases uncertainty in planning. Early humans cannot predict future conditions beyond immediate sensory cues. Cloud cover, temperature shifts, and animal movement provide short-term indicators, but not long-term forecasts. In such a world, tools serve as stabilizers, allowing groups to respond flexibly to unexpected change. The loss of a toolkit therefore reduces not only physical capability, but also adaptive range. Fewer tools mean fewer ways to respond to unpredictable events. This limitation becomes more pronounced as environmental variability increases. What is particularly revealing is that even under these conditions, early humans do not cease functioning. Instead, they continuously adjust within narrowing constraints. This adaptability is not based on foresight, but on immediate recalibration of behavior in response to changing conditions. The missing toolkit remains part of this recalibration, not as an object being searched for, but as a structural absence shaping every decision. It defines what is possible under increasing environmental pressure, and in this convergence of climate instability and technological fragility, early human survival reveals a core truth. Resilience is not the absence of loss, but the ability to continue within systems where loss is inevitable and often irreversible. Encounters between human groups in early prehistory are not always marked by conflict, but they are always marked by awareness. The presence of another group introduces a new variable into survival systems already strained by environment, scarcity, and uncertainty. Even without direct confrontation, the knowledge that others occupy the same landscape reshapes behavior in subtle, but persistent ways. In regions where early human populations overlap, archaeological evidence suggests that material culture sometimes changes in response to interaction. Tool styles may converge or diverge depending on contact intensity, resource competition, and mobility patterns. This indicates that tools are not only functional objects but also part of broader social and ecological networks. For the group in the valley, the absence of a toolkit takes on additional significance in such a context. Tools are not only instruments of survival, but also markers of capability. A group with fewer tools is not only less efficient, but also more vulnerable in situations where competition for resources becomes direct or indirect. Even without direct confrontation, competition can manifest through resource depletion. If another group has passed through the same area, they may have already exploited available food sources or raw materials. In such cases, the effectiveness of remaining tools becomes even more critical, as the margin for error narrows further. Ethnographic analogues from later hunter-gatherer societies suggest that tool possession often correlates with group confidence in navigating shared territories. Groups with more complete toolkits are able to range more widely and exploit resources more efficiently, while those with reduced tool capacity tend to avoid contested or uncertain zones. In the valley, this dynamic would not be explicitly understood but would be felt in behavioral hesitation. Movement decisions become more cautious. Exploration of unfamiliar areas is weighed more heavily against risk. The absence of tools indirectly contributes to reduced territorial flexibility. At the same time, early human cognition is highly sensitive to signs of others. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, and altered resource patterns can all indicate recent presence. These signals do not require direct observation to influence behavior. The landscape itself becomes a record of potential competition. In such conditions, tools take on an additional role as extensions of group security. A complete toolkit increases the ability to respond to unexpected encounters, whether with animals or other human groups. Loss of that toolkit therefore reduces not only efficiency, but perceived safety. Archaeological sites sometimes show overlapping tool traditions in the same geographic regions, suggesting either interaction or sequential occupation. While the exact nature of these overlaps is often uncertain, they indicate that early humans did not exist in isolation. Their technological systems developed within shared or contested spaces. The missing toolkit in the valley exists within this broader reality of potential interaction. Its absence reduces the group's ability to maintain parity with other possible groups in the region. Even if no encounter occurs, the structural disadvantage remains. Another important aspect of intergroup dynamics is information asymmetry. A group with more tools may leave more visible traces of their presence, while a group with fewer tools may leave subtler signs. This can influence how groups interpret the landscape, potentially altering decisions about movement and resource use. In some cases, archaeological evidence suggests that tool diversity increases in regions of higher interaction density. This may reflect adaptation to varied conditions or competitive pressures requiring flexibility. In contrast, more isolated regions often show more uniform tool assemblages. In the valley, the absence of a toolkit reduces internal diversity of tools available for different tasks. This narrowing of technological options limits flexibility in responding to varied challenges, whether environmental or social. What is particularly important is that these constraints operate silently. There is no explicit awareness of reduced competitiveness or altered risk profiles. Instead, behavior adjusts incrementally in response to immediate limitations. Over time, these adjustments accumulate into structural differences in survival capability. As the group continues to operate within this constrained system, the missing toolkit becomes part of a larger pattern of vulnerability. It interacts with environmental stress, resource scarcity, and potential social competition, reinforcing each layer of pressure. Yet despite these overlapping constraints, survival continues. This persistence is not due to stability, but due to constant adaptation within instability. Early human systems are not designed to avoid pressure, but to function under it. And within that function, tools remain central not only as instruments of survival, but as quiet indicators of capability, security, and position within a wider landscape of human presence. Disaster in early human worlds rarely arrives as a single defining moment. It unfolds as a sequence of pressures that gradually exceed the limits of adaptation. A flood that shifts a riverbank overnight. A sudden cold phase that reduces available food sources. A fire that moves unpredictably across dry terrain. Or a migration event that empties a landscape of familiar resources. Each of these forces can destabilize a group already operating close to the edge of necessity. In such conditions, tools become not just helpful but decisive. They determine how quickly food can be processed, how effectively shelter can be constructed, and how efficiently energy can be conserved. When environmental conditions deteriorate, the margin between survival and failure narrows, and technological capability becomes the primary buffer against collapse. The missing toolkit in the valley exists within this context of potential disruption. If the loss occurred during or just before a period of environmental stress, its consequences would be amplified significantly. What might have been a manageable inconvenience in stable conditions becomes a critical vulnerability when resources decline or movement becomes necessary. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with abrupt climatic events often shows signs of rapid cultural adjustment. Tool assemblages change in composition, settlement patterns shift, and evidence of intensified resource use becomes more pronounced. These patterns suggest that early humans respond to disaster not through static survival strategies, but through rapid reconfiguration of behavior and technology. In the valley, such reconfiguration would be constrained by the absence of the toolkit. Adaptation requires tools, but tools themselves are now reduced. This creates a situation where the capacity to respond is partially undermined by the very absence that necessitates response. One of the most significant consequences of sudden environmental change is forced abandonment. Groups may be required to leave established campsites, carrying only what they can transport. In such scenarios, selection becomes critical. Not all tools can be carried. Choices must be made about which objects are essential for survival and which must be left behind. This introduces a painful paradox. The more limited the toolkit, the more difficult it becomes to survive relocation. Yet relocation may be necessary precisely because conditions have deteriorated. The system becomes self-tightening, where reduced capacity increases exposure to conditions that require even greater capacity to overcome. Even in the absence of immediate disaster, the possibility of such events shapes behavior. Early humans likely maintained constant awareness of environmental instability. Subtle cues in weather, animal movement, and resource availability inform decisions about when to move, when to stay, and when to conserve energy. Tools play a central role in this decision-making process. A complete toolkit increases confidence in mobility. It allows groups to respond to changing conditions with greater flexibility. Without it, mobility becomes riskier, and staying in place becomes both safer and more dangerous depending on resource availability. In the valley, the absence of the toolkit reduces this flexibility. The group is less able to respond to sudden changes, whether environmental or ecological. This does not immediately cause collapse, but it reduces the range of viable responses to future uncertainty. What makes disaster particularly significant in early human systems is that it often leaves little recovery time. Unlike gradual change, abrupt events compress decision-making into short periods. There is less opportunity for adaptation through trial and error. Tools must function immediately and reliably under stress. Archaeological records of such periods sometimes show evidence of intensified tool production, suggesting urgent attempts to compensate for loss or degradation. However, if raw materials or knowledge are limited, such responses may not fully restore previous capability. In the valley, the missing toolkit represents a pre-existing reduction in capacity before any additional stress is applied. This means that even moderate environmental changes could have disproportionately large effects on survival outcomes. Another important aspect of disaster-driven adaptation is memory. Groups remember locations of past abundance, danger, and resource availability. These memories guide future movement and decision-making. However, memory alone cannot replace material capacity. It can only inform strategy. Without tools, even well-informed decisions may be difficult to execute effectively. This gap between knowledge and capability becomes especially pronounced under stress conditions. As the narrative of early human survival unfolds in this context, a pattern becomes clear. Resilience is not defined by avoidance of disaster, but by the ability to maintain function despite repeated disruptions. Tools are central to this resilience because they convert environmental uncertainty into manageable action. The missing toolkit therefore represents more than loss of objects. It represents a reduction in resilience itself, not total collapse, but a narrowing of possible responses when disruption occurs. And in that narrowing, early human existence reveals its most persistent condition. Survival is always provisional, always adjusted to circumstance, and always dependent on fragile systems that can be altered or diminished without warning. What remains after all loss is not emptiness, but continuation under constraint. Early human groups do not pause in the face of missing tools, reduced efficiency, or environmental pressure. They adjust, not because the system is strong, but because stopping is not an option. Survival is not a stable condition they maintain, but a process they keep reconstructing with whatever remains available. The missing toolkit, once a single event of disappearance, now exists only as a structural absence woven into every remaining action. It is present in the slower processing of food, in the increased care applied to each remaining tool, in the reduced flexibility of movement, and in the constant recalibration of effort against outcome. What was once an object has become a constraint. Over time, early human systems absorb this kind of loss without resolution. There is no final recovery moment, no restoration that resets conditions to their previous state. Instead, life continues under modified parameters. Tools wear down further. Materials are replaced when possible. Knowledge is reinforced through repetition whenever opportunity allows. But the original balance is not restored. Archaeological patterns across deep prehistory reflect this reality. Sites are rarely snapshots of stability. They are layers of adjustment, each one shaped by prior shortages, environmental fluctuations, and technological limitations. What appears as continuity in the record is actually accumulated adaptation across repeated disruptions. In this sense, the missing toolkit becomes representative of a broader truth about early human existence. Loss is not exceptional, it is structural. It defines the boundaries within which survival operates. The importance of tools is not only in their use, but in the fragile systems of continuity they support. Even as the group in the valley moves forward, The landscape around them remains unchanged in its indifference. Stone, water, wind, and distance continue their cycles without regard for human dependence. Within that larger system, tools exist as temporary stabilizers, brief extensions of control in an environment that does not preserve what is placed within it. Yet despite this fragility, early humans persist, not because they overcome loss, but because they integrate it. Every recovered tool, every repaired edge, every learned technique becomes part of a growing pattern of adaptation that slowly accumulates over generations. This accumulation is not linear progress, but layered resilience built on repeated uncertainty. The absence of the toolkit, then, is not a conclusion. It is one instance among countless others where material dependency and environmental instability intersect. What matters is not whether the object is recovered, but that life continues around its absence. As the valley settles into quiet, the search dissolves into routine survival activity. Attention shifts back to immediate needs. The memory of loss remains, but it no longer dominates action. It becomes part of the background conditions under which all future decisions are made. And in that quiet continuation, early human history reveals its most enduring pattern. Civilization does not begin with permanence, but with the ability to endure impermanence, to function within systems that are always incomplete, always vulnerable, and always in motion. The story of tools is therefore not only about invention, it is about dependence. And the terrifying reason early humans could not afford to lose them is not simply that tools were useful, but that without them, every other part of survival begins to unravel in ways that cannot be immediately repaired. The valley fades into darkness, as all such valleys do, but the logic that shaped it remains unchanged across time. Human survival continues, not because loss is prevented, but because it is endlessly managed, carried forward, and lived through.